Nobody was supposed to care this much about SmackDown. In 2002, WWE had created the brand split because the company had too many stars and needed two separate shows. Raw was supposed to be the flagship, the main attraction, the show that carried WWE's identity. But then, something unexpected happened. The show that was supposed to be the backup plan started becoming the show everyone was talking about. SmackDown was not just surviving, it was becoming dangerous. Because while Raw had the biggest spotlight, SmackDown had something that money could not manufacture: momentum. And the person behind this transformation was someone WWE fans never expected to become the architect of a wrestling masterpiece: Paul Heyman. The same man who had once competed against WWE with Extreme Championship Wrestling was suddenly helping create WWE's most critically praised brand. Under Heyman's creative influence, SmackDown developed a completely different identity: faster matches, younger talent, unpredictable storytelling, and wrestlers who looked like they were fighting for their careers every single week. This was the era of the SmackDown Six: Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, Edge, Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, Chavo Guerrero. Six wrestlers who helped create a style of television that felt completely different from anything else WWE was producing. Every week felt important. Every match felt like it could change someone's career. And slowly, SmackDown started doing something that was never supposed to happen. It started making Raw look like the secondary show. Because while Raw had the bigger names, SmackDown had the wrestling. Fans were noticing, critics were noticing, and more importantly, people inside WWE were noticing. The problem was not that SmackDown was failing. The problem was that SmackDown was succeeding too much. Because in WWE, there has always been one unwritten rule: nobody is allowed to become bigger than the machine. And SmackDown was starting to challenge the machine itself. Behind the scenes, the success of SmackDown created a difficult situation. The brand designed as the B show was receiving enormous praise for its in-ring quality, while Raw remained the company's traditional flagship. The growing influence of Heyman's creative direction eventually became a point of tension within WWE's creative structure. And this is where the story becomes much deeper. Because according to many wrestling observers, the fall of SmackDown's golden era was not simply because the formula stopped working. The real question was SmackDown allowed to succeed, or was it quietly pulled apart because it became a threat? To understand what happened, you have to go back to the beginning of WWE's brand split. After the company bought out its competition and absorbed the biggest names from the Monday Night War era, WWE suddenly had a problem: too many wrestlers, too many storylines, too many main event level performers. So in 2002, WWE created Raw and SmackDown as separate brands. The idea was simple: Raw would have its own roster, SmackDown would have its own roster. Both shows would compete internally while making WWE stronger. But competition creates pressure, and pressure creates politics, especially when one side begins outperforming the other. Raw had legends. Raw had history. Raw had the company's biggest television identity. But SmackDown had hunger. It had wrestlers trying to prove they belonged. It had a creative team willing to take risks. And most importantly, it had Paul Heyman. Heyman understood something that many wrestling minds forget. Fans do not connect with stars because they are told they're important. Fans connect with stars because they see them becoming important. That philosophy created stars. It elevated performers. It gave SmackDown a unique feeling. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment WWE realized the B-show was no longer acting like a B-show. SmackDown was not following Raw. It was challenging Raw. And inside WWE, that created a battle that fans never saw on television. A battle over power. A battle over influence. A battle over which vision of WWE would survive. Because while fans were watching incredible matches between Angle, Benoit, Guerrero, Mysterio, and Edge, behind the scenes, the future of SmackDown was already being decided. And the person caught directly in the middle was Paul Heyman. The man who helped build WWE's most exciting show was about to lose control of it. But the reason why was far more complicated than anyone realized. Because the downfall of SmackDown did not begin when the wrestlers stopped performing. It began when the people controlling WWE decided that SmackDown had become something it was never supposed to be.
Created something rare, a wrestling show where every performer felt valuable. But that was also the problem, because when everyone starts looking like a future star, the old hierarchy begins to feel threatened. In early 2003, WWE made major creative changes that reduced Heyman's influence over SmackDown's direction. Reports at the time indicated that Heyman was removed from much of the creative process, changing the direction of the brand. For fans watching at home, it looked like a simple creative adjustment. But inside WWE, many viewed it as the beginning of the end of the SmackDown Six era. Paul Heyman was a different type of wrestling mind. He was not interested in protecting established names just because they were established. He believed the next generation had to be created. And SmackDown became proof that his philosophy worked. But WWE was entering a new era, an era where corporate decisions became just as important as creative decisions. Raw had its own powerful figures. Triple H was becoming the centerpiece of the Raw brand during this period, holding the World Heavyweight Championship for much of 2003 and becoming one of the defining figures of the show. Meanwhile, SmackDown was creating a different type of success. Instead of one dominant centerpiece, it was building multiple future main event players, and that created a philosophical conflict. Should WWE build around one protected top star, or should WWE create a roster where anyone could become the next major attraction? The SmackDown formula answered that second question, but WWE's corporate structure often leaned toward the first. And then came the talent moves that changed everything. The same roster depth that made SmackDown special became the thing that could be used against it. Because if SmackDown was producing stars, those stars could be moved. And once those key pieces started disappearing, the chemistry that made the show special began to fade. Reflectively, the SmackDown Six were never just 6 talented wrestlers. They were a combination, a perfect storm. Remove one piece, and the entire machine changes. Remove several pieces, and suddenly, the magic disappears. This is why many fans look back at this period differently. They do not believe SmackDown simply lost popularity. They believe the formula that created its success was slowly dismantled. The question became, if SmackDown was producing some of WWE's best television, why change it? Why take away the very thing that made it special? And the answer leads directly to the biggest backstage debate of the era: control. Because Paul Heyman did not just have ideas, he had influence. And in WWE, influence is power. The more successful SmackDown became, the more difficult it became for WWE's traditional power structure to ignore it. The brand that was created as the second show was proving that a different approach could work, and that created an uncomfortable reality. Maybe Raw was not automatically the best show anymore. Maybe the audience didn't care about the brand name. Maybe they only cared about the product. And that was a dangerous thought inside a company built around protecting its flagship. The final blow came when WWE began moving toward a more standardized product. The two brands needed to feel separate, but gradually the differences became smaller. The experimental nature of SmackDown started disappearing. The unique identity created by Heyman was fading, And the show that once felt like a revolution started feeling like another WWE program. But the biggest shock was still coming, because Paul Heyman's story with SmackDown wasn't ending with him simply losing creative control. It was ending with a decision that perfectly represented the entire problem. The man who helped create SmackDown's greatest era would eventually be placed in charge of a brand that was already being changed. And that decision revealed everything about what WWE wants.
Some shows are remembered because they failed. Others are remembered because they changed everything. The early 2000s SmackDown belongs in the second category. It proved that WWE did not need to rely only on established legends. It proved that younger talent could carry television, and it proved that creative freedom could produce something special. But eventually, the experiment ended. The SmackDown that fans loved slowly disappeared. Not because the wrestler stopped caring, not because the audience stopped watching, but because the identity of the show changed. The same brand that once felt unpredictable became more controlled. The same show that created new stars became more focused on protecting existing structures. And the biggest irony? Many of the wrestlers who were elevated during this era later became some of WWE's most important names. John Cena, Randy Orton, Brock Lesnar, Eddie Guerrero. They became proof that the philosophy worked. The talent was never the problem. The system around them was. Paul Heyman's removal from SmackDown's creative direction became one of the most debated moments of the Ruthless Aggression Era. Some insiders have pointed toward creative disagreements and Heyman's strong personality as reasons his influence decreased, while fans have long debated the role of internal politics and brand competition. And that is what makes this story so fascinating. Because the question is not simply, why did SmackDown decline? The bigger question is, what would SmackDown have become if it was allowed to continue? Imagine a world where the SmackDown Six remained together longer. Imagine a world where Heyman continued building around emerging talent. Imagine a world where Raw and SmackDown truly competed as equal brands. Would WWE have created an even stronger era? Nobody can know. But what we do know is this. For a brief moment, SmackDown became something rare. A wrestling show that felt alive. A show where every match mattered. A show where fans believed anything could happen. And that is exactly why its downfall remains controversial decades later. Because SmackDown was not remembered as a failure. It was remembered as something that was taken away. The show that was never supposed to defeat Raw started becoming the show nobody could ignore. And when that happened, the system reacted. Because in WWE, there can only be one flagship. And SmackDown discovered what happens when the second ship starts sailing faster than the first. It gets slowed down, it gets redirected, and sometimes it gets silenced by Raw.